Welcome to our channel. Today we have a story that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. But before we dive into it, we want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are. If you're new here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss our next special story. Coming tomorrow. We're excited to share this journey with you, and we can't wait for you to be part of our growing community. Now let's get into the story. We promise it's worth it. You won't believe what happens when tradition faces a black royal guard. In a busy courtyard at St. James's Palace, the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves as tourists gathered around, snapping pictures and admiring the royal guards. Among them stood Marcus Hunter, a 28-year-old black U.S. Army guard, with his posture perfectly straight, his scarlet tunic gleaming in the morning light. His rifle, held with precision, reflected years of training and discipline. Marcus's presence was a testament to the modern, diverse military, a stark contrast to the traditional image that many people still clung to. He had earned his place among the prestigious royal guards through exceptional service, his dedication and skill unmatched. His background was one of strength and resilience. Born to an African-American father and a Jamaican mother, Marcus had always held his head high, knowing that his heritage only added to the rich tapestry of his identity. As the crowd continued to watch, one elderly figure stood out from the rest. John Parker, a retired officer in his late 70s, walked through the courtyard with the stoic grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the military. His uniform, although outdated, reflected his rigid adherence to the traditions of the past. Parker's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the scene before him, focusing on Marcus, who stood unwavering at his post. Without a hint of hesitation, Parker muttered under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "He shouldn't be wearing that uniform. His kind used to carry water for real soldiers." The comment was sharp, a reminder of a time when race and class were barriers to even the most prestigious roles in society. It cut through the atmosphere like a knife, and those around him seemed to pause, unsure of how to react. The tourists shifted uncomfortably, a few glancing at Marcus, who stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Parker, sensing the discomfort, continued, his voice louder now. "In my day, there were traditions about who could stand guard here. Proper traditions. The Queen's Guard represents the finest of British heritage." The words dripped with disdain, directed not only at Marcus but at the changing times themselves. He circled Marcus slowly, inspecting him as if he were a specimen to be judged. As Parker spoke about history and bloodlines, Marcus remained still, his gaze fixed forward. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. His training had prepared him for this moment. Despite the harsh words being thrown at him, he stood as a symbol of what Britain had become, a nation that valued merit over lineage, discipline over outdated norms. Meanwhile, the crowd had begun to take notice. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others held their phones, recording the confrontation. Marcus felt the weight of the moment but remained composed, just as he had been trained. Parker, however, was relentless. He continued his verbal assault, speaking of regiments, bloodlines, and the proper way of doing things. His words grew more venomous as he criticized the military's standards, claiming that traditions were being diluted in the name of political correctness. "In my time, men like him would have never stood guard here," he spat. As Parker's words grew more biting, Marcus didn't take the bait. He simply stood tall, his expression unshaken. The silence between them thickened, as if the entire courtyard was holding its breath. The contrast between the old officer's frustration and the young guard's unwavering discipline became a silent but powerful statement in itself. Parker's grip on his own convictions seemed to weaken with every passing moment. It was as if the very traditions he held dear were slipping away in the face of the world Marcus represented. This was a clash of two eras, one rooted in prejudice, the other in progress. And in this brief exchange, Marcus's strength, calm, and dignity were the loudest voices in the room. Marcus Hunter's path to becoming a U.S. Army guard at St. James's Palace was not one of privilege or ease. It was forged through years of perseverance, driven by an unwavering belief in his own worth and the strength of his heritage. Born to an African-American father and a Jamaican mother, Marcus had always known the weight of prejudice and expectation. He was raised in a community where opportunities were limited, where people like him were often made to feel that their dreams were too big for the world to accept. But Marcus refused to accept those boundaries. From a young age, he demonstrated an exceptional work ethic, mastering every challenge thrown his way. Whether it was excelling in his military training or proving himself on the field, Marcus was always determined to break free from the constraints placed on him by society. His discipline was his weapon. It was this unyielding commitment that led him to be selected for the prestigious role of a ceremonial guard at one of the most iconic palaces in the world. But even as Marcus stood tall at his post, a quiet storm brewed in the hearts of those around him. Some admired his position, recognizing his talent and effort, but for others, particularly those of the older generation, Marcus's presence was an uncomfortable reminder of how much had changed and how far the world had moved from the ideals they had once held dear. Enter John Parker, a retired officer, whose sense of superiority was rooted in the traditions of a bygone era. At 78, Parker's world was one of strict adherence to rules and customs, where bloodlines and heritage dictated who belonged and who did not. He had spent decades in the military, rising through the ranks with the belief that only those from East, certain families, those with the right background, were worthy of the highest honors. So, when he set his eyes on Marcus, a black man in the uniform he had long believed belonged only to men of his kind, the clash of ideologies was inevitable. Parker couldn't understand why someone like Marcus would stand guard at the palace. To him, it was a direct challenge to the old order, an affront to everything he had been taught to uphold. It wasn't just about race, it was about identity, about preserving the image of what Britain, and by extension the military, was supposed to represent. As he observed Marcus, Parker couldn't contain his disdain, his old voice cracking as he muttered insults under his breath, loud enough for the surrounding tourists to hear. The tension between the two was palpable. Marcus, unmoved by Parker's words, remained steadfast in his role. He had been trained for moments like this. Years of military discipline had ingrained in him the ability to withstand verbal attacks, to focus on the task at hand, and to rise above the petty prejudices of others. As Parker's insults grew louder, accusing Marcus of not belonging, of undermining centuries of tradition, Marcus did not flinch. His posture remained as perfect as it had been when he first stood at attention that morning. The tourists, caught in the middle of this unexpected confrontation, began to whisper among themselves. Some felt uncomfortable, others felt compelled to speak out, but the situation seemed to unfold like a slow-motion drama, with Marcus and Parker locked in their silent battle. Parker continued to lecture the crowd, speaking about the importance of heritage and history, while Marcus's stillness became the very embodiment of the new world that was rising around them. Marcus had earned his place here. His uniform wasn't just a symbol of his duty, it was a symbol of the world that was now possible for people like him. It wasn't just about tradition, it was about progress, about demonstrating that the military, once a bastion of old world thinking, could evolve and include all who proved themselves worthy. Marcus knew that every second he stood there, unflinching in the face of Parker's outdated views, he was making a statement, a quiet but powerful one. As Parker continued his tirade, Marcus's mind wasn't on the insults but on something far more important. He was representing something bigger than himself, a symbol of change, of unity, and of the future. This was no longer a battle of words, but a battle of ideals. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had already won. The future had arrived, and there was nothing Parker or anyone else could do to stop it. As the confrontation between Marcus and Parker continued, the tension in the air grew thicker, almost palpable. Marcus stood, unflinching, while Parker's words grew sharper, more insistent. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, some of the tourists watching in hushed silence, others recording the moment on their phones. It was as if the entire courtyard had become a stage for a battle of ideals, a battle where one man was desperately clinging to the past, and the other was quietly, but firmly, representing the future. John Parker, the retired officer, had always been defined by his rigid beliefs. Raised in an era where status and heritage dictated one's place in society, he believed that the military, and by extension, the British traditions he held so dear, were meant to preserve these boundaries. To him, Marcus's presence as a ceremonial guard was not just an anomaly, it was an affront to everything he stood for. He had spent a lifetime serving in the military, rising through the ranks, and he expected the same from those who followed. His own achievements, his decades of service, were the foundation upon which his worldview was built. And now, standing in front of Marcus, he saw nothing but a challenge to that world. "You don't belong here," Parker muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. He was trying desperately to provoke a reaction from Marcus, to force him to show some sign of weakness, but Marcus remained stoic, his gaze fixed ahead as though the words meant nothing. To Marcus, this wasn't just about one man's disrespect. It was about something much bigger, a chance to prove that he too was worthy of being in that uniform. Parker's insults became more personal, digging into Marcus's background, questioning his heritage, and undermining his very existence as a part of British military tradition. "In my time," Parker continued, "we had clear standards about who could serve. You wouldn't have been allowed to even carry the rifle, let alone stand guard at the palace." His words were sharp, as if slicing through the very air. The tourists around them began to murmur, some shifting uneasily, others exchanging uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere was charged, almost electric, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing a pivotal moment. But Marcus, despite the barrage of insults, remained unshaken. His face was calm, his posture perfect. He had been trained for this, not just in physical discipline, but in mental fortitude. He knew that to react would be to give Parker the victory. So he stood there, silently defying the very prejudice that sought to strip him of his dignity. Parker's voice rose, louder now, his frustration becoming evident. "You're just a symbol," he spat, his face reddening with anger. "A mockery of tradition. What is this? Political correctness gone mad?" He had abandoned any semblance of respect, his earlier veneer of professionalism slipping away. As Parker circled Marcus, he could feel the growing disapproval from the crowd. The older tourists, those who had perhaps lived through the era Parker romanticized, now seemed to shrink away from him. His words, once filled with authority, now felt hollow, like the echo of a time that had passed. Marcus remained calm, his breath controlled. He had earned this position through years of hard work and sacrifice, and he knew that his presence here, at St. James's Palace, standing as a symbol of Britain's evolving military, was more than just a duty. It was a testament to the progress that had been made. And as much as Parker tried to tear it down, he couldn't. Parker, realizing that he had failed to provoke a reaction, tried a different approach. He leaned in close, his voice now a whisper, as if trying to exert some last bit of authority. "Stand aside, guardsmen," he said, his tone demanding. "I'm a superior officer, and I give you an order." The words were meant to command, to remind Marcus of his place in the world. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if taking a moment to process the request. The crowd fell completely silent. The tension between them, the old officer and the young guard, had reached its peak. It was no longer about words. It was about dignity, respect, and a clash of worlds. And in that moment, Marcus's unwavering silence became the most powerful statement of all. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between Marcus and Parker reached its boiling point. The air in the courtyard felt thick with unspoken words, and every passing second seemed to stretch into eternity. Parker's words had become more venomous, more desperate, but Marcus remained unmoved. The crowd, once passive observers, now seemed to lean in, their attention completely focused on the unfolding confrontation. It was as if they all knew they were witnessing not just a moment of personal conflict, but a battle of ideals, a clash between the old world and the new. Parker, sensing his grip on the situation slipping, took a few steps closer, trying to get under Marcus's skin. His voice was now a low growl dripping with disdain. "You stand there in that uniform as though you belong," he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "But you don't understand what this uniform represents. It's not just about discipline or duty. It's about lineage, blood, the right kind of family. You don't belong." The words cut through the air, sharper than ever before. The tourists around them shifted uneasily, some exchanging glances, others glancing nervously at the approaching security personnel. Marcus, however, did not flinch. His eyes stayed locked ahead, his expression unchanged. It was as if he were impervious to the verbal assault. His body was a picture of military discipline, calm, collected, unwavering. He had trained for moments like this. He had known that serving in a ceremonial role at St. James's Palace wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be people like Parker, clinging to outdated beliefs and racist ideologies, who would try to tear him down. But he also knew that he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing something bigger, something far more significant than the petty prejudices of one old officer. As Parker's tirade continued, Marcus stood firm, his thoughts not on the insults being hurled at him, but on the legacy he was building. His family, his ancestors, had served in the military with honor, and he was now adding to that legacy. The bloodlines Parker spoke of, the ones that Parker believed were essential for military service, meant nothing to Marcus. What mattered was the commitment to duty, the integrity, and the love of country. Marcus's presence here was proof that times had changed, Britain had changed, and he, Marcus Hunter, was part of that change. Parker, realizing that his verbal attacks weren't breaking Marcus's composure, grew even more agitated. His frustration was palpable. "This is madness," he shouted, his voice rising, echoing off the stone walls of the palace. "You're not fit to wear that uniform. It's an insult to everyone who truly served." The old officer's face was red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He was no longer the dignified, commanding officer he once was. He had become a man on the edge, a relic of a world that no longer existed. The crowd, who had been watching in silence, now murmured among themselves. They had seen Parker's insults. They had seen Marcus's unwavering response, and they began to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had once been on the verge of boiling over now seemed to evaporate, replaced by a collective sense of unease. Some of the tourists took a step back, while others, unable to stay silent any longer, began to speak up. "This is wrong," one woman said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You shouldn't treat him like that." Marcus's gaze shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the support that was slowly building around him. But he didn't break his stance. He didn't engage. His focus was on one thing, his duty. He had earned this position, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Parker, make him feel otherwise. Finally, Parker's voice faltered, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. "This isn't right," he muttered, almost to himself. The realization was sinking in. He had failed to provoke Marcus, and in doing so, he had exposed his own ignorance, his own narrow view of the world. The old officer stood there, his pride shattered, unable to reconcile the reality before him with the world he had once known. As the quiet grew, Marcus's voice finally broke through the tension. "I understand, sir," he said calmly, his words carrying the weight of someone who had been through more than just physical training. "I understand that your generation sees things differently, but we protect the crown differently now. I've earned my place here just as you did in your time. My service doesn't make me any less British than you." It was a simple, direct statement, and it was, in that moment, the most powerful thing anyone could have said. Marcus had stood his ground, not with anger or defiance, but with dignity and truth. And in doing so, he had won not just this battle, but a larger, more important fight for respect, equality, and progress. As Parker stood there, struggling to maintain his composure, Marcus remained exactly where he was, calm and composed. The air in the courtyard seemed to freeze, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone around them. Parker's harsh words had lost their edge, and though he tried to salvage his pride, it was clear that the tide was turning. The old officer's attempt to provoke a reaction from Marcus had failed. His voice, once full of command and certainty, now wavered, sounding increasingly hollow. Marcus, however, did not react with anger or pride, but with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "Your world is fading, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm, cutting through the tension that still hung thick in the air. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations. It wasn't just about military service or tradition anymore. It was about acknowledging the world that had changed, the progress that could not be undone. Marcus wasn't there to challenge Parker's service or the sacrifices he'd made in his time. He was there to show that his own service, and the service of countless others like him, was just as valid, just as valuable. "I respect what you've done," Marcus continued, his tone gentle but firm. "But that doesn't mean I have to accept the outdated views you've lived by." Parker blinked, his brow furrowing as he processed Marcus's words. For a moment, it was as if he were hearing them but not truly understanding them. His face, which had been so set in anger, now began to shift, the rigid lines of authority crumbling beneath the realization that the world he had known was slipping away faster than he could grasp. He had spent decades serving in a military that prided itself on its traditions, its hierarchy, its rigid structure. But those structures were no longer the same. The world Marcus represented, the one of diversity, progress, and inclusion, was now at the forefront. I don't know what to make of all this," Parker muttered under his breath, his voice cracking slightly. It was the first sign of doubt from the old officer, the first crack in the hardened shell he had built around his beliefs. It was as if Marcus's presence had broken something deep within him, something he had long refused to acknowledge. The tourists, who had been silently watching the exchange, began to shift, their discomfort now evident. They had witnessed the bitter exchange, the sharp words and accusations, but now they were seeing something different, the realization of a man who could no longer reconcile his views with the reality before him. Marcus, still standing at attention, didn't push. He didn't need to. His presence, the sheer dignity in his calm response, spoke louder than any angry retort could have. He had shown Parker, and everyone else around them, that it wasn't the color of the uniform or the heritage behind it that mattered. What mattered was the integrity, the character, and the unwavering commitment to the duty it represented. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally, Parker let out a sigh, the kind that seemed to carry all the weight of a lifetime of struggle. His gaze softened as he met Marcus's, and for the first time since the confrontation had started, he spoke with a hint of acknowledgment, though it came with the weight of grudging respect. "Your father was a good soldier," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I remember him. He served with honor." The words hung in the air, the admission stark and raw. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time, Parker saw Marcus not as a symbol of everything he feared, but as a man who had earned his place in history, just as he had. The crowd around them, which had been caught in the tension of the moment, began to exhale collectively. There was a sense of release in the air, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. It wasn't just the confrontation that had ended, it was something more profound. Parker, the man who had once believed so strongly in his version of tradition, had come face to face with a new reality, a reality where Marcus, with his discipline and dignity, stood as a beacon of the future, a future that embraced change, inclusion, and progress. With a final glance at Marcus, Parker straightened his back, the military bearing returning to his posture. But now it was different. The world he had fought to preserve, the one he had once seen as the only world, was gone, and in its place stood something new, something stronger, something that Marcus, through his unwavering composure, had made impossible to ignore. The old officer turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silent courtyard. It was the first step into a world that was no longer defined by bloodlines or tradition, but by the values of equality, respect, and dignity for all. Thank you so much for watching this powerful story unfold. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what happened today. Do you think Marcus handled the situation with the right amount of dignity? How would you have reacted if you were in his shoes, facing such prejudice? We know this is a heavy topic, but it's one that needs to be discussed, and your perspective matters. Take a moment to reflect. How do we, as a society, continue to challenge and break down outdated prejudices? What role do we all play in promoting equality and respect in our own lives? Let us know your views in the comments section below. Also, if this story inspired you or made you think differently about tradition, change, and respect, we'd love for you to share it with someone who could benefit from it too. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next story. We're committed to bringing you more powerful narratives that challenge the norms and inspire growth. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us, so please leave a comment. Let's keep this important conversation going.